Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good to see you.
Great, good to see you.
Okay, we have the diversity panel here. And I wanted to introduce our speakers. We have Samantha Harris from, I'm unused to using the full name, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. She's the Vice President for Policy Research. We have Michele Rovinsky, Mayor, who is Vice President, Office of Equality and Diversity at Drexel University. And we have Nicki, who is the President of Speech First. So we only have a half hour. And as people always tell me, I'm one of those people who's not only dull myself, I bring out dullness in other people. So I'm going to rely upon my speakers to carry the weight here. So I live in a different world than some of the previous panels, being president of the University of California. I'm an expert on riots, insurrections, occupiers, and anarchists. And so I have a number of questions, mainly focused on students, and I want to ask our panelists. And one thing I wanted to say is, which is in the discussions of academic freedom, freedom of expression is not free in America. It is not free. It cost Berkeley $6 million. At the University of Florida, they called up the National Guard. Ohio State refused to allow a speaker to speak at all. There was a lawsuit that was dismissed. It is very expensive. And at least the law is, you're not supposed to take that into account, but any president will tell you, if you have to spend $6 million on the physical safety of the campus, that's an issue. That has to be an issue. So our role today, I think, is to talk about the flip side of this. Sort of, I think almost all of us, probably all of us, are in favor of upholding freedom of expression on campus. But there is a cost. That is, students are sometimes alienated. Maybe Professor Wax would say we shouldn't pay that much attention to their feelings or whatever, but they are, and they're upset. They say that we don't belong. And so when a Milo comes to campus, or someone who is racial, I remember a speaker, one of my favorites at Vassar, a woman, a social work professor from Rutgers, who at a gender conference proposed the theory that Israeli soldiers were cutting up Palestinians for body parts to transfer them to Israeli citizens. And the president said, "Ain't the First Amendment great?" It wasn't quite the way I felt about it, although I would not have silenced her. So what I want to talk about is the role of the president as moral leader on campus. The Chicago principles, which you've heard about, they're somewhat ambiguous. And the other thing is they don't just relate to the classroom speech and academic freedom. Chicago principles say that the university is not going to take positions on partisan things. And presidents do that all the time. On DACA, they do it. On race matters, they do it. On gender matters, they do it. On President Trump, I mean, they do it all the time. And so the question is, you know, are those the right principles? I personally defied them. The Reverend Farrakhan came to campus. He was invited by a student group, didn't try to shut him down. I said, the Reverend Farrakhan is a great guy. It happens he's an anti-Semite and a homophobe. That's my view. And I said it, but I felt that I was expected to show moral leadership, but you can't do that every day. So let's start with Samantha. What should the conscientious president do when these great controversies come to campus, who is respectful of the First Amendment and not seeking to undermine it?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important, you know, these major controversies do occasionally come to campus, but every day there are much more significant, I think, insults to the rights to freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry, simply that come about as the result of faculty members or fellow students who say things that, you know, students then call for the censorship of. And so I think this is really where presidents and other administrators need to step up as leaders and need to step up and not give in to what I would call illiberal demands. I mean, students have every right to protest. You know, I want to give the example right now from Sarah Lawrence College, a professor named Sam Abrams. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in the fall in which he criticized the lack of ideological diversity among college administrators. And for this, his office was vandalized. You know, people called for him to be fired. And now, 6 months later, as part of a series of protests by a group of students calling themselves the Diaspora Coalition who occupied the president's office, they demanded that he be put up for a tenure review before a panel of the Diaspora Coalition, that the university issue an apology and condemn his op-ed, and that he issue a public apology. Now, I believe that the president of the administration, who thankfully didn't, as I feared she might, give in to the demands, but she didn't take a strong moral position. She didn't say this is absurd. This is a professor who weighed in on an important issue in the New York Times. How dare you call for him to be fired or you know, be stripped of his tenure? You know, and I think a lot of times what happens is either administrators and leaders of universities don't say anything at all and leave these people who have spoken out twisting in the wind, or worse yet, in the case of, you know, Harvard with Ron Sullivan, which I know came up in the first panel, they actually, you know, Harvard, the Dean Khurana said he was launching a climate review because of Dean Sullivan's decision to defend Harvey Weinstein. So too often there's just a lack of leadership around the core issues of free speech and due process coming from these leaders, which again is not to say that students don't have the right to protest. You know, sitting in an office is another thing because that's civil disobedience, but from a free speech standpoint, students can make whatever demands they want, but I think it's incumbent on an administration that cares about these things to take a strong leadership position and say, no, you know, we stand for free speech, we stand for diversity of thought, and we're not going to, you know, countenance these demands by even taking them seriously.
Yeah, I know your boss, Greg, was very upset at Yale because there was an opinion about what costumes to wear or something like that. And, you know, it wasn't an academic freedom case, but it was a chance to stand up for free speech. And in my view, it didn't happen. So let me ask you, Michele, you know, you're probably bombarded and your president's bombarded. Everyone wants to condemn someone. It's the American way. And it happens all the time, and you worry about your moral force. You worry about whether you know the facts or not. And you have the mess that the lawyers have handed you over 200 years. So what do you do?
Well, I think that university presidents and administrators have to be engaging in conversations with their community and educating the community on an ongoing basis, so that they're not just relying on one incident or one occasion where they're really going to just be out there speaking. I think presidents and senior administrators need to be part of the conversation where we're enforcing and supporting all rights, including free speech, freedom against harassment and discrimination. All of the rights need to be protected and talked about on an ongoing basis.
But you issue a statement. You know, at Fresno State, Mrs. Bush passed away. Mm-hmm. Some professor said, I'm glad she's dead. President Bush was a terrible man. And I mean, a lot of students didn't like it, alums didn't like it, the others who liked it, I guess, being California. But when do you issue a statement? It's fine to have conversation. What do you do when it comes to your office? You walk into the president's office and you say, Mr. President, Ms. President, do this.
Well, we certainly can't be responding to everything, so you have to pick the big ones. I think that sometimes you need to use your judgment and not respond is sometimes as important as responding. So I think I would say really take a deep breath and understand kind of the lay of the land, what's happening on your campus, and pick wisely on things that others are already responding to. And what is necessary for you to respond in your campus.
Does it matter to you who's protesting? You find a noose in the library, and the African-American students are very upset by it, as opposed to some other sort of incident?
Yeah, I think that's one where the president needs to be very vocal, because it has a direct impact on our campus. So I think that that's one a factor also. Does it have a specific impact on our campus? Then it becomes more clear that the university president needs to get out there and get in front of it.
And that may be an exception to the Chicago rule, if it's your students and so forth. I wanted to ask Nicki what you thought about this. What would you tell the conscientious administrator, diversity and inclusion office, with regard to the moral obligation to lead a university, even though you're not a supporter of Milo, you're not a supporter of racism or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for schools to get out in front of it before Milo comes to campus even, right? I mean, Princeton did a great job, I guess this past year, 2 years ago. They gave out Keith Whittington's book, and they incorporated free speech principles into their incoming freshman orientation. And so they laid out a marker very early on. This is what is expected of you. These are principles we believe in. Because I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of students getting to campus now who don't understand the beauty of the First Amendment, that this is something that has been used throughout history, for the past 200 years here, but free speech in general, right? It's helped abolitionists get the word out. It's helped suffragists. It's helped gay rights activists. This is something that
Jehovah's Witnesses and all.
Right, disenfranchised groups, it's often the only tool
Give me some
they've
help
had.
on this one. How do we do that? I criticized shouting down the Israeli ambassador because I thought he should be able to speak. I wasn't endorsing him or not. I met with a group of student leaders and they said, Mr. President, you don't understand. The First Amendment is for marginalized people. It is not for privileged people like you and others. That's what they told me. Now, I mean, we can talk about dialogue and conversations. How do you have a program in civic education that's mandatory? I don't know if that does any good. Is anyone listening? Well, what do you think, Nicki? How would you go about doing that?
I mean, different schools have done different things. It's sad to me that this is a problem that, this is something that people get to college not understanding this at all, right? I mean, the mere fact that, on some campuses, the first time you really understood the First Amendment is, well, this is why Richard Spencer can come. I hate the First Amendment. I mean, there's a real failure in our high schools and junior highs if we have to get to that point.
Well, I think that's true, but, the unwashed come to the university and we have to deal with them as they are. Tawny said something like that. They're on the plains of England, the unwashed young people. What do you think, Michele? What would you? I mean, you could do a lot of education. Not you. Well, maybe you personally, but I'll start with Michele, and then we'll go to. I mean, programmatically, is there anything to be done? We have a lot of mandatory courses. Everyone's supposed to understand everybody else.
I think University 101, that's offered for all freshmen, is a great way to introduce these topics. I think, as you said, K through 12 is a great time to educate students on free speech, academic freedom, free speech in general, so that when they come to campus, they really do understand it in the context of all the other rights that exist. I think that having dialogues on our campus, open dialogues. I know the Pennoni Honors College has dialogues. Having those kind of conversations that are well publicized and on an ongoing basis, so that students are being introduced to these, not just in the classroom, but in the extracurricular spaces on campus.
Chicago sent out a letter. There are some training type programs, letter to freshman students, and. But it's not so easy because not everyone wants to dialogue with you. I learned that from the anarchists. They really weren't that interested in my perspective.
Can I offer a couple?
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
So I just want to build on what they're saying and offer a couple of suggestions. One, I think that we need to move, when talking to students about free speech, beyond the First Amendment and into why free speech as a normative value is important. Because, it's like we were talking about backstage. There are a growing number of people who believe the earth is flat again. And it's because they've never actually had to confront, okay, well, why do we know the earth? Why do we believe the earth is round? What's the evidence for that? And I think we've kind of gone to that place with free speech where we sort of default to, well, of course they can say that because of the First Amendment. And so now you have a generation of students who are saying, well, wait a minute, the Constitution wasn't written for me. I wasn't considered a person in society when that was written. It was just written by a bunch of dead white guys for white guys. And they don't understand that free speech is a value in and of itself beyond the First Amendment and the Constitution. And so I think we need to do more education around why free speech, irrespective of the Constitution, benefits everyone, and in particular, people without a voice. I also think the K-12 piece is critically important because, while yes, colleges do need to deal with students as they arrive on campus, I think that our K-12 institutions could do a much better job of preparing students. We've moved a lot from the idea of actual civics to this sort of civic engagement model in schools where students are encouraged to participate in activism without actually getting a grounding in why those things are important. And there was a program, actually, my 11-year-old daughter a few months ago stood on this stage as part of a citizenship challenge that was put on by the Rendell Center. It's for 4th and 5th graders in the 5-county area. And the topic this year was why the First Amendment matters. And I went in and helped her class prepare. Her little group was among the finalists. And it was really instructive to me to talk to these kids about free speech and see what they thought, how they answered certain questions without having ever been prompted to think about them before, and then how they answered those questions when somebody had actually talked to them and challenged them on their sort of initial reactions and things like that. And from my daughter's group and all these groups, I saw so much evolution in terms of their beliefs about free speech, and it was really moving to see these kids up here talking about why free speech was important. And it made me think, that was a wonderful thing, but that's a local organization that serves the 5-county area. We need more of this nationwide, I think.
Nicki, I wanted to ask you, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Speech First gets into this. From a lawyer's standpoint, I'm talking about the students, but one is, what is the condition of your rules? What rules, are they clear? Do we understand them? What do they say? And the second thing, which needs to be discussed, is the role of the police. And again, I'm not talking about civic education, but there is a role for the police because sometimes you have real dangers to health and safety of the campus. You have disruption. In Florida, they closed down the whole campus. The libraries were closed. The hospitals didn't take patients except in emergencies. I admit I'm talking about the more extreme examples and not what Samantha was talking about, the more day-to-day sort of stuff. So what do we need to do to clean up the rules? What do we need to do about enforcement? We live in a therapeutic era, right? You break the rules and you get 2 weeks in a health facility. What's your advice? If a university comes to you and says, what does Speech First think is wrong with our rules? What ought we do about it? How do we enforce them?
Well, they would go to fire to learn how to reform. They would come to me if they wanted to get in trouble. As the non-lawyer, I would say, we have brought 2 lawsuits in the past year against University of Michigan and the University of Texas, and they had policies in their books that were, we believe, unconstitutionally vague and unconstitutionally broad. Their speech codes and their bias response teams were worded in a way where it's impossible to know what you can be in trouble for. Who's saying what's offensive? Who's defining what's uncivil or rude? Those are very broad terms. That's in the eye of the beholder. And I doubt it's going to be, some constitutional scholar. It's not going to be Jeffrey Rosen deciding what that is. And so, if you are gauging that based on impact, even if I didn't mean to hurt your feelings and I did, and you still went and complained, and I can be hauled through a disciplinary hearing. In my mind, that doesn't pass muster.
So they need crisper rules, and what should the rules say?
They would need to word them, to better define what is banned, what is not. We were talking backstage about, what is a proper harassment definition. So I will let my diversity officer friend.
But you can't prevent the speaker from speaking. Of course, violence. That was a problem at the University of Virginia. I believe in free speech, but when people are carrying automatic weapons and torches, I tend to be more deferential. It just is a problem, the open carry laws and all that. What should the relationship between Michele, the administration be in interpreting the rules and with the police? Do you get, when you have a controversial speaker, do you talk to the police department on campus? Do you have a police department on campus?
Yeah, we do have a police department. Yeah, they're actively involved, and it really is, I think it has to be a partnership. So we have a team that comes together to look at from all different angles. Understanding, setting clear expectations to make sure there's safety on campus, but allowing the speech to happen, and having people who are listening to the speech understand that they have rights too. that everyone has rights. But I think there's multiple players in this situation. Part of it is safety, but part of it is education before you even get to that part.
What do you tell the police to do? Ultimately, the administration is responsible for the police, just like a big city mayor or whatever. At the end of the day, he or she may be a flautist or an English professor or whatever, but they're police chief for that campus, particularly when there's an exigency of some sort. What do you tell the police?
Is allow the speech to happen unless there's an imminent threat of safety.
Okay, and who makes that judgment?
The police chief.
Please, do you instruct the police chief?
That's not my particular role on
Okay.
campus, but there is a team of people that review those plans.
Should there be someone from the administration there, dean of students, deputy, whatever, an associate dean of students?
Should be there
on
during
site,
this.
because
Yeah.
I mean, there is civil control over
Yeah.
university police. At San Francisco State, there was a big problem, and there was an administrator who made the call, and the speaker could not finish the speech. I mean, that was it, and she just didn't want to make the call, and they just were caught flat-footed, I would say. What do you think about that problem? I know that's far from your, I don't understand the reasons for the First Amendment and the search for truth. By the way, it doesn't always get to the truth, by the way, the First Amendment.
I think in terms of the relationship between universities and the police, I think one thing is that the police need to be better trained in how to handle some of these speech controversies on campus. I think some of them, like some of the things we've seen at Berkeley, there are situations, particularly when protesters and people come from off campus, that just escalate beyond anyone's control and what anyone had expected. I mean, there are going to be times, just as there are times in society at large, where police and others who are preparing for security and things are going to be caught by surprise by either the ferocity of something or the size of a crowd. So obviously, those things are going to happen. But for example, there was just a case, we just wrote a letter to the University of Portland because the police there stood down and allowed one protester ringing a cowbell to shut down a speech because they didn't want it to become a dangerous situation. And I think that, there needs to be, and it is funny, and, for those of us who are familiar with you're going to need more cowbell, Saturday Night Live sketch, that was the first thing that came to mind. But, there needs to be a better understanding by police, some of whom are not necessarily trained in these free speech issues, that they do have an obligation, that their primary obligation is to protect the right of the speaker to speak and of the audience to listen. Obviously, there may become a point when things spiral out of control and become too dangerous, and obviously public safety comes first. But what we've seen in many instances is, campus police or even, security who've been brought in erring much too much on the side of shutting things down before it gets to that situation. But I also think there needs to be better education of students of the line between acceptable protest and disruption. And it's not an easy one to figure out because protest doesn't have to be completely silent, right? You can boo,
Sure.
but when
I've done
something
it.
becomes a sustained disruption, that is not a protected exercise of free speech because you're disrupting the speaker's right to speak and the audience's right to listen. And of course, this is also, we're talking about, a speech like this and where people have been invited to speak. It's different if somebody's just speaking in the public square and someone else is trying to drown them out. That sort of competing voices situation is different. But I think we're all thinking of sort of the same situation where a student group invites a speaker to speak and then someone else decides to shut it down. And I think there needs to be better training about the need to protect the speaker's right to speech and to only shut things down as a last resort.
Yeah, I think that the law is drifting that way in an unsteady. It's called the heckler's veto. It's do you allow the people who are objecting to the speech to prevent it from happening? But most of the cases are very old. But they're drifting in the direction you say. That is, your first obligation as a speaker. But if you have one police officer and 10,000 rioters, it's probably all right to drive the speaker off. So it's a reasonable course of conduct to provide for the health and safety in this situation. Should the police, and I ask this out of experience, in the modern world, you mentioned Portland and a cowbell, a grave threat to the polity. What happened to Paul Revere? I don't know. If you're advising the president wouldn't you prefer, Nicki, to have, in a big campus I'm talking, a full-time police officer doing intelligence work? And I don't mean snooping on people and spying in the physical sense, but all they do is talk on the internet. And you can tell how many, and even the off-campus groups, which I admit are a big problem, are they going to come on campus and all the rest of it? I mean, it may be a violation of the use all reasonable steps to protect the speaker if you don't do your homework and you have the capacity to do it. Now, it's expensive. I'm not saying that it's cheap, but what do you think about that, Nicki?
I mean, I'm a libertarian, so I don't like the idea of policemen just listening all the time. No, I mean,
They're just reading. They're just reading.
Just reading. I think, in my mind, the biggest threat to free speech on campus actually is from silencing. I'm more worried about chilling, that students are not talking, they're not having conversations, they're self-censoring because of these confusing, overbroad policies, the way that students see some of their colleagues' problems adjudicated on campus. I think a lot of them feel that universities are picking winners and losers, and they feel that they're not, that their concerns won't be taken seriously, and so they just refrain from having difficult conversations altogether. And that's what concerns me more than the odd protest is just, if you are paying $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year in tuition and room and board, and you're not having hard conversations and you're not learning anything, that's a waste of money.
A lot of the pressure is peer pressure too. There's sort of there is a stealth problem. I mean, I once was in charge of arranging a venue for Alan Dershowitz at Berkeley. It's not easy to represent Alan Dershowitz. And we couldn't get a single department to invite him. Not a single department until we got to the Jewish Studies program and the chancellor. They did it. I don't know what to do about that. I mean, I think that the fear in untenured professors, I think in my classes, there are issues I was having trouble in my con law class discussing, like affirmative action. It just was to some people. And I talked to criminal law professors. Many of them no longer teach the law of rape in their criminal law courses in law school. That's a reality. Because, I don't know the exact size, but some, many, most, I don't know, women find it very hurtful to get into those issues. But to me, that's a problem. That's a problem. I don't know how you reform it and make the law of sexual assault work if in a law school you can't discuss the state of the law, where it should be headed, and how to punish the miscreants. I mean, to me, that's at the heart of the matter. Does anyone have any ideas on what we do with stealth boycotts and stealth silencing and shunning?
Can I?
Oh, shun away.
No, what I was going to say is I think that what we've seen in opinion polling and things like that is that a majority of students actually do support free speech.
Yep.
But I think that we are allowing on campus a loud minority of people who really oppose free speech and open debate to sort of cow the rest of us into silence. And I think that, because you hear from people all the time, faculty or other students who are facing these situations, that they get a lot of silent, emails of support and things like that, but no one's speaking up for them publicly. So for example, Sam Abrams, the professor I talked about, right? The group of students occupying the president's office demanding, his public apology and public shaming, a very small group of students. Where were all the other students speaking up and saying, we support you, we support your right to free speech, you should be able to write these things? So I think part of the way we solve this problem is people need to have the fellow students, fellow faculty, because I know faculty are scared. So when they see one of their colleagues getting in trouble, they don't speak up because they're scared, but they should speak up because they're scared. They should speak up and say, no, this is unacceptable. We need to create a culture where the majority of us who actually do support the right to free speech are speaking up for it and are speaking up in defense of people who are facing censorship, because the isolation that people feel when they're in these situations and no one's speaking up for them is really profound. If you knew that if you had one person calling for your censorship, you'd have 10 people writing, equally vociferous op-eds and letters to the editor and holding protests against your censorship, it would be a different ballgame. And that opinion, that sentiment is out there, but it's quiet because of fear, and we need to change that.
Well, the truth is, many students, it's not just fear, it's lethargy, and they don't want to be involved. I mean, I can never get a chemistry professor to speak out. If he or she thinks they're on the way to a Nobel Prize, they're not going to speak out on some public issue that they consider damaging. Well, I think, if I have this right, we're about out of time. And I've been very careful. I didn't create a safe space, but I engaged in no microaggression to my knowledge. And I want to thank our panelists for being here. You did a terrific job.